we'll just export them.
I mean, that's just one of the things. They believe in a technological paradise, you know, in which you'll have programmable matter, which is a form of transmutation of base matter into something
Yeah.
more refined.
Yeah, we could have replicators. Who knows? I really think that at the moment, if we had replicators, the only thing we'd replicate would be, you know, old TV shows and pornography. So it's like the internet. Human beings are human beings. Yes.
I just wanted to know if you had any information about the role of Garibaldi.
Garibaldi.
Garibaldi, the leader of the
Oh, yes.
the revolution, because he brought together the two big Masonic houses in Italy, and he was also linked to Malta. And
Yes.
maybe, you know, there was some kind of linkage.
That's a little bit out of my time period. I don't do well in the 19th century. It's too recent. I much prefer the 16th. But yes, Garibaldi was a Mason, and he was actually in league with the House of Savoy, who had been foes of the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. And it was a good attempt, but in Italy, you know, never did away with the church. So that's kind of the problem there. And the same thing happened. In other words, in the fallout from World War I, the most ruthless, you know, rises to the top. Il Duce.
Vincent, could I suggest, you had mentioned intriguingly a theme which our audience here is not familiar about, when you said the secret of some mysterious John, who may have been the John the Divine or John the Baptist.
Okay.
Well, the audience here doesn't know that Vincent just led a tour of Saint-Remy in South France, in which the central theme was, maybe.
Yes, who is this mysterious Saint John that these guys are the knights of?
And if I may, the reason I'm excited to see this discussed is because John, Eon, Xion, to branch perfectly means fractality, so I admit to having a bit of a agenda here. Sorry, please.
One of the peculiar sort of little points here is the prominence of Provence. And again, one of the few auberges of the knights still left, it's now the Archaeological Museum, is the auberge of Provence. So the influence of Provence on the Knights of St. John, whether or not they were actually founded there, is enormous. And it boils down to exactly who St. John might be. Now, that's not necessarily part of the alchemical secret, that's part of that second secret, the secret of physical transmutation. Remember I said the Tibetan idea of attaining your diamond body, Padmasambhava? Padmasambhava, in attaining his diamond body, was able to generate such charge that he could melt the rock and squeeze his hand in it like Clark Gable in Wet Cement on Hollywood Boulevard. And it's pretty amazing. It's not carved. I've been there. I've stuck my little pudgy handprint in it.
He melted the
He
stone.
did it.
He melted the stone.
Melted the stone and left such a charge on the mountainside where he melted the stone that miraculous events to this day happen spontaneously. In fact, a little bit further down the mountain, there's a Ganesha shrine that has about an 8-inch high image of White Tara, a Tibetan bodhisattva, emerging from the stone. And over time, over the course of years, you can actually see it getting sharper and clearer. And nobody's carving it, you know, nobody's working it, it's simply coming out of the stone. So that's the kind of energy we're talking about. Now in the West, we don't have any exemplars like that. In other words, we talk about Christianity and Jesus, and okay, he was a great teacher, and yes, he rose from the dead, maybe, you know, but we don't have any direct exemplar to say, okay, other than being God's son, how do you attain transformation, transcendence? Well, it turns out, remember I mentioned those Cathars, who are the Christian version of the Shia. Turns out that we do have some of those. It's just that the Catholic Church killed them all.
Oh, the usual.
Ah, yes. Cherchez la femme, cherchez la Catholics. Okay. In southern France, very soon after the crucifixion, a group of Jesus' family, including Mary Magdalene, probably his wife, her sister Martha, their mother-in-law, or Joseph's mother, and the mother of two of the disciples, along with Lazarus, St. Maximin, and St. Sidonius all arrived in southern France, a little area called St. Marie de la Mer. And apparently, Mary Magdalene was pregnant with Jesus' son and gave birth in a cave down the road in the ancient city of Glanum.
Which Vincent led us on a tour of, which was amazing.
And even more amazing is that we were able actually to find it because Leonardo da Vinci was privileged to the secret and did a painting called The Virgin of the Rocks, which shows the cave very clearly.
And he showed us the viewpoint there that shows up in the pink, in the cave, in the far
So,
across it.
this particular individual is shown in several places, and we were able to follow a lot of those on the ground in Provence, as either Saint John or Saint Trophime, the Holy Triumph, Holy Trophy. And it's recorded, in fact, this month's copy of Sacred Planet magazine in France, in French, has an article that hits a lot of the same things we were doing, but without connecting the dots. And it even mentions the story I'm about to tell you. Saint Trophime was supposedly so holy, according to the later legends, that Jesus himself came down from heaven and left a miraculous knee print in a coffin lid in the Ala Champs in Arles.
Which we saw.
Or Saint Trophime himself attained his diamond body like Padmasambhava and left his own knee print. Now, Leonardo da Vinci painted another painting called St. John the Baptist, or St. John in the Wilderness, or St. John as Dionysus, that shows an individual sitting on a particular spot up on the mountain with 3 rocky islands in the background, and his left knee prominently thrust out, and a rod pointing to the place, and he's pointing in the famous Da Vinci gesture back over his shoulder towards Glanum. So Da Vinci was one of these people that also knew this particular secret. St. John, interestingly enough, apparently attained his enlightenment meditating in a hypogeum. Now, the connection between Malta and southern France is very obscure, but roughly 1,000 years after the hypogeum and the temples here, someone was building hypogeums and some pretty bizarre temples in the region around Arles, those 3 rocky islands in Leonardo's paintings. And much later, a couple of thousand years later, John, St. Trophime, meditated in those caves in his hypogeum and attained a certain degree of enlightenment. Now, one of the
son of Martha.
One of the sources we have that perhaps relates to this individual is one of Malta's favorite people, St. Paul. You remember St. Paul was on his way to Rome because he'd gotten into a lot of trouble in Jerusalem. Well, the trouble he got into in Jerusalem was because of this fellow called the Egyptian, who was some sort of foreign Jew. And there is a connection from very ancient times between this region in southern France and Egypt, as there is connection between very ancient times between Malta and Egypt. And this fellow is known in Acts of the Apostle, as the Egyptian. He arrived in Jerusalem preaching a whole new form of Christianity. Paul challenged him to a duel with words in the temple courtyard. It descended into a melee. Paul was arrested. He declared before the governor that he was a Roman citizen, so the governor shipped him off to Rome. And on his way to Rome, he was shipwrecked on Malta, etc.
And the rest is history.
The rest is church history.
So
So,
they had to do just for that.
say what?
And in church history, I like the way you said that.
So St. Paul and Luke, whoever Luke was, describes this fellow as being a foreign, perhaps Egyptian Jew, who arrived in Jerusalem, did not win against St. Paul, and left with a large number of pre-diaspora Jews back from wherever he came from. Now, we know it's not Alexandria, so where did he come from? The probability is, given the date, that they were going to southern France. And this little region of southern France, from the time of Caligula's cousin, Germanicus, who was the brother-in-law of Caesar Tiberius, if I'm not mistaken. He invited all the Jews from Palestine who wanted to immigrate to this region of southern France. The idea was that they would increase trade, that they could build their own little temple, and therefore they wouldn't have to send all that money to the temple in Palestine. And oh, by the way, we'll get rid of some of these troublesome Jews, so Palestine won't bubble over. That was moderately successful. So in southern France, you had this little colony of Jews right next to the Proto-Celtic Ligurians and the Greeks and the Romans. Really a cosmopolitan mix. And that mix was overwhelmingly Christian, but a Christian of a different variety, by around 50 AD. And the date for the Egyptians' arrival in Jerusalem is 56 AD. So by the time Paul got stranded on Malta, there was already a large community of Christians around the family of Jesus in southern France. And perhaps the Egyptian was our mysterious St. John, St. Trophimus, who left his Negro.
And some of Sarah the Egyptian, is that Egyptian?
Yes, the gypsies in Provence, to this day have a saint called Saint Sarah. And it's a huge festival where all the gypsies come, and they take the relics of Saint Sarah and the relics of the two Marys down to the sea and then back to the church. It's quite an event.
So John's blood would have been the blue-black Egyptian somehow, maybe.
Well, blood is always blue if you have a white skin. But yeah, we don't know necessarily what color it was. Now, the connection to what we're talking about is that both the Templars and the Knights of St. John focused on one of these St. Johns, either St. John the Baptist or St. John the Evangelist, as their special figure. So that their feast day of St. John to both of these orders is very prominent. And considering the cover story about the Order of St. John, starting in Provence, even though the person that it was claimed as the founder didn't exist, we find no trace of it, we can perhaps say that the St. John of Jerusalem is the same as the Egyptian that St. Paul had the brawl with. And in that case, this particular branch of the crusading orders were the ones who protected that particular quality of the secret. In fact, the secret Masonic order that is recognized as the first Masonic order here on Malta was the Order of St. John the Secret and the Harmony. So it's like the harmonious secret of St. John. What could that be? Now, the confusion is over which St. John, but they're really looking in the wrong direction. It could be this St. John from Provence. And it could be, again, if you wanted to start a secret society around a tradition that was very old and predated Christianity, went back to a better source than the Catholic Church, then what better source could you have than this provincial, true Christianity? Now, the Cathars apparently were also in on the secret. They had a book written by a St. John called the Book of Love that we know had some passages that may have been part of the Gospel of John, and which seems to be a first-person description of the events in Palestine. And we also have several other bits of this book that we know about that tend to point to some pretty heretical ideas. Now, the Cathars, of course, were simplicity itself compared to the church. In those days in Provence, we're talking the 12th century or so, late 12th century, early 13th century. The priests were corrupt. They were as bad as the rulers or worse. They oppressed the serfs, they owned land, they would only occasionally perform masses. You had to pay to be buried, and you had to pay for them to light candles for your soul, etc. Whereas the perfecti, the Cathar priest, lived in poverty, lived among the people, taught spirituality, practiced healing, never charged any money. And below them were various ranks of lay people who could participate in the spiritual experience at various levels. Now, the Catholic Church thought that this was way too good of a thing. And then again, southern France was just way too rich and abundant and had way too much prosperity and freedom and free thinking. So 1208, over a minor scuffle over another papal legate, similar to the 30 Years' War, the Pope declared a crusade against the Cathars in southern France. And over the course of the next 30 years or so, more people were killed in southern France than were killed in, say, World War I. And to this day, regions of Languedoc, from Provence all the way across the Pyrenees, are depopulated. Some of those villages have never come back to their 12th century level. And as you drive through the region, you find all these half-deserted villages, ruined castles up on the mountaintop and so forth. It's like a sort of a ghost town. And the center of all that is the very strange town of Carcassonne. That's where it all started. And it was marched on by Simon de Montfort, who was sort of the bad guy in charge. And first they wiped out everyone in that region, and they just continued spreading until in 1244, the last little group of the Cathars were trapped on a mountain called Montségur, and rather than be killed by the Romans, the Catholics, they were martyrs. They marched down and jumped into the bonfire all by themselves. Now you have to ask yourself, what kind of religion is it that would have that kind of fervor that you could march down the mountain and jump in the bonfire? Well, it's a religion that preaches love and peace and just what we were talking about. We're all one people. We all have the same values. And also believes in reincarnation. And you have to ask yourself as well, what kind of religion would it be that would make all those people march down the mountain and jump into the bonfire? So in the long run, Catholicism has a lot to answer for. But all of these threads do seem to interweave around the Knights of St. John.
And just the 1 minute that the stone that John melted with his knee became the Grail.
Well, that may be the origin point of all the Holy Grail stories.
This is what Vincent taught us in France. You see, the origin of the Grail is part of this.
So, any other questions? Dan, do you have another topic you'd like to?
Break the
Yes.
stone.
Yes.
I wonder if
The stone became the Grail.
you've ever thought of this, in the biblical stories, that the knee is a euphemism for the penis.
Yes.
So it is actually the origin of,
And it is in the
of
Grail
generation.
stories. It is in the Grail stories as well. The Fisher
So the
King is
knee.
wounded in his thigh.
Right, the thigh with Jacob and the
Yeah.
angel.
Same thing.
So maybe it's,
And again, there are descendants, Jesus wasn't just a special case,
yeah.
or, gay, that he had a right to have a family. So you have.
No, I was going to say, I was in Ethiopia for a while, and they have a very strong belief there that the Ark of the Covenant was brought over to Ethiopia,
Aksum.
and that there's a town there which was probably directed and engineered, and the building of it was directed by the Templars, because the level of engineering is such that they cannot imagine how it could have been conceived otherwise. It's called Lalibela. I don't know if you've
Yeah, I
and
read.
they compare it to the cathedral in Chartres, the sort of level of engineering prowess.
Yeah, I've read Graham Hancock's book. I've actually met Graham a few times. If there was such a thing as the Ark, it probably ended up in Ethiopia. But the jury's still out on exactly who built all those structures. But yeah, that's quite conceivable to me. If you look on some of the temples in Egypt, it's really easy to trace who the Queen of Sheba was. And she was probably Ethiopian, the land of Put. I see Alfred standing up with.
Well, my question is, since you have been in Malta and today in Gozo, have you found something which can enlighten us?
Well, I think I found a really nice place to retire. Is that what you mean?
Well, no. I've also decided to retire there this morning. But I don't know anything about history, but really, you captured my attention all the way through. The sound of your voice, as if you lived it yourself. It's not something which you read, it's something which you feel.
You want to talk about how Valletta looked in the 18th century?
Sorry?
You want to talk about how Valletta looked to the 18th century and how the arch, I'm teasing.
He remembers.
Wait. Gozo was really amazing.
Yeah.
Malta is just really amazing. It's this odd mixture of Eastern influences and just this strange Baroque fantasy land. It's just awesome. Now the temples, I'm going to talk a little bit more tomorrow after we see a few more of them. Let me just say that so far I found nothing to disprove the thesis that I came in here with, and a lot to talk about on that thesis. But as I talk so fast tonight, I gotta have something for tomorrow, otherwise I'm just gonna.
Well, why don't you say what your subject tomorrow is?
Well, tomorrow we're gonna talk about what really are these things. You know, what are they for, why are they here, who built them? From an archaeological point of view, I'm not an outer space Atlantean kind of guy. However, I still am not that fond of the outer space hypothesis. However, I must say, standing in front of the Giants Temple today and looking around at a couple of other places, you know, Atlantis might not be a bad hypothesis. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Vincent, would you like to go a bit more controversial a bit later and tie the Brits back into the story here?
Well, no, I wouldn't, but I thought it was controversial enough revealing the most successful secret society in history, and that it started right here, and it's still going on, by the way. Yes?
I'm just excited that we're in the midst of history right now.
Oh yeah, everybody is.
Because there's going to be another change.
Yeah, okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested in the transformation that took place in the alchemical tradition between the search for the philosopher's stone, and you briefly brought in the idea of monoatomic gold. And there's still a whole school of people today that believe that monoatomic gold can bring some sort of immortality, physical immortality, as opposed to spiritual transformation. And so there was this changeover from a group of scientists who are earnestly trying to recreate possibly monoatomic gold for lengthening of life rather than to create wealth. And from that it transformed into this idea that alchemy is all about personal transformation on a spiritual level. So I wonder whether you could say a little bit about this changeover. Who were the people responsible for the changeover? Do you think the changeover was made in order to conceal the true mission that they had?
Let me start with that one. No. That whole process that you're talking about is to conceal the fact that they don't have what they think they have and they really don't know what they're talking about. Okay, monatomic gold in the Egyptian sense is a byproduct of the transmutational process. And again, it will strengthen your aura, strengthen your electrical field, increase your immune system, have some healthy benefits. But I would not recommend eating either mummy dust or monatomic gold. In other words, that's sort of a shortcut. And the Egyptians didn't eat it, okay? They produced it. So eating it, being exposed to it is probably not a good thing. In fact, Dan used to carry a little bag of it around and would pass it around and see how creepy everybody felt. So it's not a good thing, okay?
It's actually a bit dangerous.
Yeah, it's one of those things that are demonstration of the theory. In other words, the fact that mummy dust and the fact that we can reproduce it as monatomic gold, that we can do that suggests that, okay, there is something to the theory. But actually being able to cause a substance to jump its electronic shell, its atomic shell, is a whole different subject.
It's about charge collapse, and that is what we do this weekend.
Yes.
And where Vincent is
Dan will tell you more about
talking about, it's actually the vaporized gold or palladium that's in the meteoritic glass, and the dielectric quality, the electric field of that glass is the key. That's the clue, and that is where we go in the science.
Okay, and in fact, I'll explain a little bit more of that. It's not enough just to have the glass. It's not enough just to, you know, insert the palladium in an infusion in gas and seal it in glass or whatever. The Venetian glassmakers tried that in the Middle Ages. That's how you got the beautiful red stained glass, was vaporizing gold and, you know, inserting that into the glass. That's not going to do it. If you start off with one of these meteoritic substances, you've got to keep in mind that we know about beryllium and we know roughly what was in the cobblestone because of the color. But we do not have any good chemical analysis for why moldavite is green. It ain't copper. Okay? It's not copper sulfide. It's nothing that would normally produce green. And the blue version of moldavite, which is very rare and only found in a small section, really seems to be very odd. That we have no idea what those heavy metals could be. We could be looking at something iridium, rhodium, or even stranger, some sort of unstable half-life. What we do know is that if you take that and you subject it to heat in a place where multiple magnetic lines cross.
The symmetry of which is rich.
Yes. And there are very few places where that happens naturally. It usually is formed, like in Egypt, where a lot of people over a long period of time have worked with these lines that will produce one of these crossing vortexes. Now, the reason why Kelly stumbled onto this was not just that he discovered the blue form of moldavite. Their benefactor, when Rudolf II threw them out of Prague, a fellow by the name of Wilhelm Rosenberg, had an old castle down in southern Bohemia at a little place, you're going to love this, called Madalena Springs. And there's a chapel there from the early 11th century, 1035, 150 years before the Magdalene cult emerged in southern France. That is directly on the crossing of 4 very powerful magnetic lines. Plus it has a vault that's shaped like a torus. Dan will have a lot more to say about torus, but it's shaped like a torus. And they worked, their alchemical laboratory was in this vault underneath the church. So whether they were aware of that, whether that's the reason why they moved in with Rosenberg at the old castle or not, that's the combination of stuff that produced the powder of projection. Now it could be that when the Templars discovered the Mecca stone, they also discovered a Hebrew manuscript, and there are a couple of candidates for at least part of this, that would explain to them how you create magnetic lines from the rising and setting of certain stars, or how you find these magnetic lines from the rising and setting of certain stars, and that you do your transformation at those places. And we do know the Templars were in a lot of very strange places. And we do know from dowsing and geomagnetic work on some of their commanderies and chapels that they tended to choose very interesting places. And that they also built octagonally, 8 sides. Now the 8-sided structure is again connected with the Magdalene. And at the Madalena Chapel in southern Bohemia, you have 4 lines making 8. And if you look at the Maltese cross, what do you see?
8 points.
8 points. So that whole secret is sort of wrapped around each other. But you need one of these crossing points to spark it.
We're going to talk about how lasers create conjugation and self-organization. And the picture of that is the Maltese cross, literally.
So if you have one of these geomagnetic spots, and you're working with this very, very heavy metal rich and very energetic substance, the primal materia, in that situation with heat, and again, human concentration, you have to bring to bear the laser-like focus. Okay? Now in Kelly's case, it was, oh Jesus, we have to do this or you're never going to get out of here alive. And that sort of pressure does cause you to focus. So that kind of focus, the magnetic lines and the proper substance, made it pop, for want of a better word, and created the powder of projection, or the Philosopher's Stone. And as long as you didn't touch it, as long as it wasn't contaminated, just a very small kernel of it was enough to change a large quantity of base metal, any kind of base metal, and bump its atomic structure up to gold. Now, it's not a literal substance. It's a catalyst.
It's an electric field generator.
Yeah, it's something that works directly on the atomic level.
And it is
Of
also,
the atom.
it's also bioactive, and we'll be discussing more about that as well.
The bioactive capacity is where the idea of long life comes in. And again, Cagliostro claimed to be 6,000 years old in his better days.
Yes, but if we go back to the Bible, they mention quite a few people who are very, very long lived.
That's right.
And really all of this originated in Egypt, did it not? Because when Moses left Egypt, he took with him the secrets of the Egyptians. So that whatever was contained in the Ark of the Covenant, many people believe today, it was something that he brought away with him from Egypt.
It could have been one of the meteoritic bins. The pyramidions, the little small pyramids on top of some of their ceremonial obelisks, like the one at On or Heliopolis, was known to be meteoritic. I actually own a piece of the bin from the Zoser's pyramid at Saqqara. There was a high altar there with a pyramidion and obelisk that was connected to Heliopolis and then connected to Giza. And we were just lucky enough to be kicking around in the stone one day and picked up a piece of it. And it is very dark green. It's like the deepest, richest moldavite you've ever seen. Very dense, very heavy. And it does have some sort of electric charge. So, maybe the Egyptians made use of it. Maybe that was part of the secret that Moses stole. Maybe there was just a really hot glass meteorite inside the Ark of the Covenant.
But also, we can't forget that the atmosphere may have been different earlier on Earth, and there may have been a canopy that protected us from harmful rays.
Well, we're
So, I
not
mean, it could have
talking.
been like
We're
that.
not talking that early. We know that the atmosphere from, say the 18th century BC was roughly the same as ours. We don't have any special pleading on that. We can do things like core samples and so forth. Now, if we want to talk 13,000 years ago, yeah, there's changes back
All
there.
the pre-Diluvian stories all
Right.
around the world
Right.
suggest that the canopy collapsed.
Well, I don't know about that, but
No.
yeah. Anyway, in the historical times that we're talking about, the atmosphere was much the same.
So on this weekend, we're going to go into much more detail from the electrical engineering viewpoint of what that electric field is, why it causes seed germination and human bliss, and its relationship to fusion, which starts with the symmetry of the charge collapse that is gold. So we start with that. That's what the physics we start with this weekend, really. But I'm not a historian. I can't mention a single date, but the physics I can explain in great detail. So.
Yes, Alfred.
Another question came to mind. So with all these changes in the energies and 2012 you mentioned, is the truth going to surface? Will the church finally apologize to Mary Magdalene? Will there be some sort of...
Are they going to
The
apologize?
Pope is apologizing for a lot of things.
I don't think they're going to apologize for that one. We just on the French trip, Dan's mission, we climbed all the way up to the only Tibetan-style monastery in the West, which is the cave, the Grotto of Mary Magdalene at Le Bon. I mean, it looks like something out of Bhutan. It's amazing. Climbed all the way up there. What did we find when we got up there? A nice Dominican in skirts scaring the crap out of school children. And what was he telling them? Oh, Mary Magdalene wasn't a small sinner. She was such a sinner. She had to live in this dank cave, wrapped in nothing but her hair, and crying all the time before she could be forgiven for having a sex life. I mean, really. So don't those guys know you go to hell for telling lies? So I really don't think the church is going to apologize for that. But if we get lucky, there might not be any Catholic church. In which case, there'd be a lot of artwork up for sale. A lot of nice spaces for theaters and parties.
And they might give the money back to the witches. You don't know.
Yeah, really. That would be good. Repatriation to everyone who can prove they're a descendant of the 60 million women killed by the witch cult.
So this has been a public relations effort for the Catholic Church. Thank you very much.
I'm talking about Le Beau.
Le Beau.
Yeah, I went there to the chapel.
Ah, yeah.
There was a book, and it was signed by Leonardo da Vinci also. There were signatures in this book, open in the chapel.
Da Vinci signed it.
I haven't seen that.
Because I was seeing the signatures, and that's the one that's
Huh?
picked, because I knew who he was, the others, I mean,
Huh?
it's,
I
yeah, that
didn't
little
see a
chapel,
book
that
up there,
little
but I
cemetery.
will admit to being rather put off by the Dominicans. Also, it was a really rough
It was
climb.
a quiet day.
It was a really rough climb. So.
Yeah.
Well,
Any other questions?
Vincent, there's a really nice picture down in the cathedral too, which shows St. John kneeling